at a luxurious hotel hosting a charity gala for the city's elite. A 12-year-old black boy in tattered clothes walks in and asks to play the piano in exchange for a little food for his sick sister. The entire room bursts into mocking laughter. The hostess sneers and challenges him to perform a piece that even top conservatory students struggle with. They think they're about to witness a joke, but they have no idea that standing before them is a prodigy, the grandson of a legendary musician. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers of the Royal Grand Hotel cast brilliant light across the marble floors where 300 of the city's wealthiest donors mingled at the Gala Concert for Children charity event. Women in designer gowns worth more than most people's annual salaries chatted over champagne flutes, while men in $1,000 suits discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the center of it all, her $2 million diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured toward the massive Steinway piano on the stage. At 45, she was the undisputed queen of high society heir to the Whitfield textile empire and tonight's event organizer. This year's gala will raise over $5 million for underprivileged children, Eleanor announced to a circle of admirers, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had never been told no. Of course, it's important that we help the right kind of children, the ones who can truly benefit from proper guidance. The guests nodded approvingly, sipping their $200 bottles of champagne, while servers in white gloves offered caviar on silver platters. The irony was lost on them entirely. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a small figure had been watching for the past 3 days. Marcus Thompson, 12 years old, pressed his face against the cold glass, counting the guests as they entered and exited through the golden revolving doors. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, torn at the knees and stained with dirt from sleeping under the Jefferson Bridge. His sneakers had holes so large he'd stuffed them with newspaper to keep his feet dry. Marcus had been planning this moment for weeks. His 8-year-old sister lay sick at their makeshift shelter, coughing through the nights with asthma attacks that grew worse each day. The free clinic had given them an inhaler, but it was nearly empty, and they needed money for food and medicine. Marcus had only one skill that might help them survive. He could play piano like an angel. Taking a deep breath that sent shivers through his hungry body, Marcus pushed through the revolving door. The warm air hit him immediately thick with the scent of expensive perfume and gourmet food. His stomach cramped with hunger as he saw tables laden with more food than he and his sister had seen in months. The first person to notice him was a waiter carrying a tray of lobster canapes. The man's eyes widened in disgust as he took in Marcus's appearance, and he quickly stepped backward, nearly dropping his tray. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the classical music playing softly in the background. "I was wondering if I could speak to whoever's in charge." The waiter looked around frantically as if Marcus might be carrying a bomb. "Security." He called out, his voice cracking with panic, but Marcus pressed forward, making his way toward the piano on the stage. He had practiced this speech in his mind 100 times. As he walked, more heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The elegant crowd began to part around him like he was carrying a contagious disease. "Oh my God," gasped a woman in a $15,000 Chanel dress, covering her nose with a silk handkerchief. "How did that get in here?" "Someone call the police," muttered a man in a custom-made tuxedo, pulling his wife protectively behind him. "This is exactly why we need better security." Marcus kept walking, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. In his pocket, he clutched a faded photograph of his grandfather, Samuel Jazz Hands Thompson, the only family he had left besides his sister. His grandfather had taught him to play piano before he died 2 years ago, and Marcus knew that music was his only chance at saving them both. Eleanor Whitfield noticed the commotion before she saw Marcus. She turned from her conversation with the mayor's wife, her perfectly applied makeup highlighting the sharp angles of her face as her expression shifted from curiosity to absolute revulsion. "What in God's name is that doing here?" Eleanor's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. She strode toward Marcus in her 5-inch Louboutin heels, her Dior gown trailing behind her like a battle flag. Marcus stopped in front of the piano, looking up at the woman who clearly commanded respect from everyone in the room. He straightened his shoulders, trying to make himself look as presentable as possible despite his circumstances. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Thompson. I was hoping I could play piano for your guest tonight. Just one song, in exchange for some food for my sick sister." The request hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Eleanor's face flushed red with indignation, and the guests around them began whispering frantically among themselves. "Are you out of your mind?" Eleanor's voice rose to a near shout. "This is a private event for respectable people. We don't allow beggars to wander in here and make demands." "I'm not begging, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger despite the fear racing through his veins. "I can really play. My grandfather taught me. I just need—" "Your grandfather," Eleanor laughed, a harsh sound that made several guests join in with nervous chuckles. "Let me guess, he was some street musician who taught you to bang on piano keys in subway stations." The crowd was growing larger now, with people pulling out their phones to record what they assumed would be an entertaining spectacle of a homeless child being removed from their exclusive gathering. Some were already laughing, treating Marcus like a sideshow attraction. "Look at this," sneered a woman holding a martini glass, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The little street rat thinks he can play classical music. What's next is he going to offer to perform brain surgery? Someone needs to teach these people to stay in their place," added a man in a navy blue suit, adjusting his gold watch that cost more than most families spent on rent in a year. "This is what happens when we're too soft on the homeless problem." Marcus felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His sister was depending on him. She was probably coughing herself awake right now, wondering where her big brother had gone. "Please," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "My sister is really sick. She's only 8 years old and she can't breathe properly. I'm not asking for charity. I can earn the money. Just let me show you what I can do." Eleanor stepped closer to Marcus, her towering height, making him crane his neck to look up at her. The disgust in her eyes was so intense it felt like a physical blow. "You want to know what you can do?" Eleanor's voice was ice cold and sharp enough to cut glass. "You can get out of here before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. You and your sob story about your sick sister are not welcome here." "But I really can play," Marcus insisted, taking a small step toward the piano. "If you just give me one chance." "Don't you dare touch that piano," Eleanor shrieked, causing several guests to jump. "That instrument is worth more than you'll see in your entire miserable life. Security." Two large men in black suits appeared, as if from nowhere, their hands already reaching for Marcus's thin arms. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high, eager to capture the moment when the dirty child would be dragged away in humiliation. Marcus looked around desperately at the faces surrounding him. 300 people, each one wearing enough jewelry and clothing to feed his sister for months, and not a single expression of sympathy among them. They looked at him like he was something disgusting they'd found on the bottom of their shoes. "This is what's wrong with this city," Eleanor announced to her audience, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "These people think they can just walk into our world and take what they want. Well, I have news for you, boy. You don't belong here. You will never belong here. And if I ever see you near this hotel again, I'll make sure you're arrested." The security guards grabbed Marcus by his arms, their grips tight enough to leave bruises. As they began to drag him toward the exit, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the polished marble floor. He looked exactly like what they said. He was a dirty, desperate child with no business being in a place like this. But in his pocket, his grandfather's photograph seemed to burn against his chest. Samuel Thompson had played piano in the finest jazz clubs in Harlem back in the day. He had shared stages with legends, and he had taught Marcus that music was the one thing that could never be taken away, no matter how poor you were or what color your skin was. As the security guards dragged him past the tables of untouched gourmet food, past the guests who turned their backs to avoid looking at him, past Eleanor Whitfield, who watched with satisfaction as her problem was being removed, Marcus made a silent promise to his grandfather's memory. Somehow, some way, he was going to prove them all wrong. Just as the security guards reached the marble steps leading to the exit, a calm voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Wait." The single word carried enough authority to stop the guards in their tracks. They turned still, gripping Marcus's arms, to see an older Asian man in an elegant black tuxedo walking toward them. Professor David Chen, 55 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades commanding respect in concert halls around the world. "Release the boy," Chen said, his voice soft but firm. The guards looked uncertainly toward Eleanor, who stood frozen with her mouth slightly open, clearly not expecting this intervention. "Professor Chen," Eleanor said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't know you were attending tonight. This is just a small disturbance we're handling." Chen had taught at Juilliard for 20 years before retiring to focus on discovering young talent. His reputation in the classical music world was unassailable, and even Eleanor Whitfield couldn't dismiss him lightly. The guests whispered among themselves, recognizing the famous pianist and pedagogue. "I was invited by the mayor," Chen replied smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks as he studied Marcus with professional interest. "And I couldn't help but overhear this young man's request. He says he can play piano." Eleanor's face flushed red again. "Professor, surely you don't believe that this child could possibly have any musical training? Look at him." Chen stepped closer to Marcus, ignoring the murmurs of disapproval from the crowd. He noticed immediately what others had missed. Despite Marcus's disheveled appearance, his posture when he stood near the piano had changed. His shoulders had squared, his hands had unconsciously positioned themselves as if holding invisible keys, and there was something in his eyes that Chen recognized from decades of teaching gifted students. "What's your name, son?" Chen asked gently. "Marcus Thompson, sir," Marcus replied, his voice stronger now that someone was actually listening to him. "And who taught you to play?" "My grandfather, Samuel Thompson. People called him Jazz Hands." Marcus's voice took on a note of pride despite his circumstances. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. He had heard that name before, buried in the history books of American jazz. Samuel Thompson had been a legendary pianist in the Harlem scene of the 1960s and 70s, though he'd faded from public memory after retiring. "Jazz Hands Thompson was your grandfather?" Chen asked, and Marcus nodded eagerly. Eleanor stepped forward, her patience clearly exhausted. "This is ridiculous. Professor Chen, I respect your expertise, but surely you can see that this boy is just making up stories to get sympathy. Even if this grandfather existed, how could a homeless child have learned anything meaningful?" The crowd murmured in agreement. Several guests were still recording with their phones, hoping to capture what they assumed would be an embarrassing failure. The children of the wealthy attendees watched from behind their parents, their young faces reflecting the prejudices they were already learning to carry. Chen studied Marcus for a long moment, noting the calluses on his fingertips that only serious pianists developed, the way his eyes kept drifting to the Steinway piano on the stage, as if magnetized to it. "I propose a test," Chen announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. Eleanor's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What kind of test?" "Let the boy play. One piece. If he fails to demonstrate genuine musical ability, then you were right to have him removed. But if he succeeds—" Chen paused, looking directly at Eleanor. "Then perhaps we owe him an apology." The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Some guests were already pulling out their phones to record what they expected to be a humiliating spectacle. Others whispered bets about how quickly the boy would fail. Eleanor's mind raced. Agreeing to this test was a risk, but she was confident that a homeless 12-year-old couldn't possibly play well enough to impress an audience of sophisticates. And if he failed publicly, it would serve as a perfect example of why people like him didn't belong in places like this. "Fine," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But I choose the piece, and I set the conditions." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. This was his chance, but he could see the cruel calculation in Eleanor's eyes. "If you want to prove you belong here," Eleanor continued, walking toward the piano with theatrical slowness, "then you'll play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata Third Movement, the most technically demanding piece I can think of, and you'll play it perfectly with no sheet music, no practice, no second chances." The crowd gasped. Even the musicians among the guests knew that the third movement of Moonlight Sonata was brutally difficult, requiring years of training to master. Eleanor had chosen it specifically because failure was almost guaranteed. "And when you fail," Eleanor added, her smile growing wider and more vicious, "you'll be banned from this hotel permanently. Security will be notified never to let you near this building again." The police will be informed that you're a trespasser. You'll never have another chance to embarrass respectable people with your pathetic begging." Marcus felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on him. His hands trembled slightly as he realized what he was agreeing to. If he failed, he would lose his only idea for helping his sister. But if he succeeded— "And if I play it correctly?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Eleanor's laugh was harsh and confident. "If you can actually play Moonlight Sonata Third Movement perfectly, I'll personally give you $500 and apologize to you in front of everyone here." She said it with such certainty that several guests chuckled, treating it like an obvious joke. The idea that this ragged child could accomplish such a feat was absurd to everyone present. Everyone except Professor Chen, who was studying Marcus with growing interest and concern. The boy's reaction to the challenge wasn't panic or confusion. Instead, Chen saw something that made his breath catch recognition. Marcus knew this piece. "Do we have an agreement?" Eleanor asked, extending her hand toward Marcus in a mockery of a formal handshake. Marcus looked at her perfectly manicured hand, then at the piano gleaming under the chandeliers, then at the crowd of people who were already laughing at what they assumed would be his inevitable humiliation. In his pocket, his grandfather's photograph seemed to pulse with warmth. His sister was counting on him. This was his only chance. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, taking Eleanor's hand and shaking it once firmly. "We have an agreement." The crowd erupted in whispers and muffled laughter. Eleanor's smile was triumphant as she gestured grandly toward the piano. "Then by all means," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "show us what you can do." As Marcus walked toward the Steinway, he could hear the comments from the crowd. "This is going to be painful to watch. Someone should stop this before the kid humiliates himself. I almost feel sorry for him." Almost. But Marcus barely heard them. His grandfather's voice was echoing in his memory, as clear as if the old man were standing right beside him. "Music isn't about where you come from, Marcus. It's about where you're going. And when you sit at those keys, you're going exactly where you belong." The piano waited for him like an old friend, its polished surface reflecting the crystal chandeliers above. Marcus had played on broken keyboards and donated uprights, but he had never touched an instrument this beautiful, this perfect. He was about to find out if 3 years of sleeping under bridges had made him forget everything his grandfather had taught him, or if the music was still alive in his soul, waiting to prove that talent could bloom anywhere, even in the darkest places. Marcus approached the Steinway Model D as if he were walking toward an altar. The piano, worth more than $200,000, gleamed under the crystal chandeliers like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. Every step he took echoed in the suddenly silent ballroom, where 300 of the city's elite held their breath in anticipation of what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. The boy's thin frame looked even smaller next to the massive concert grand. His torn sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished marble as he reached the piano bench. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the pristine black and white keys that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. "This is painful to watch," whispered a woman in diamonds, loud enough for others to hear. "Someone should put the poor child out of his misery." Eleanor Whitfield stood with her arms crossed, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she tapped her foot impatiently. Her smile was predatory, confident in her victory. She had chosen the most difficult piece she could think of, knowing that even conservatory students struggled with Moonlight Sonata's third movement. But Professor Chen watched with different eyes. As Marcus adjusted the piano bench with smooth, practiced movements, Chen noticed the boy's technique. Marcus didn't fumble with the adjustment mechanism like an amateur would. His movements were economical, professional, as if he had performed this ritual thousands of times before. Marcus tested the pedals with his feet, a subtle motion that most of the audience missed entirely. Then he placed his hands above the keys, not touching them yet, but positioning his fingers with the curved precision that took years to develop. His posture straightened, his shoulders relaxed, and something extraordinary happened. The ragged homeless boy seemed to transform before their eyes. The hunger and desperation that had marked his face moments before were replaced by a serene focus that belonged in concert halls. His breathing slowed, his eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them again, they held the quiet confidence of a master preparing to work. "He's actually going to try it," someone murmured in the crowd, but their voice seemed to come from a great distance. Marcus had entered that sacred space that all true musicians knew where the world outside the music simply ceased to exist. For 30 seconds, Marcus sat in absolute silence, his hands poised above the keys. The audience grew restless. Some began to whisper that perhaps the boy was too overwhelmed to even begin. Eleanor's smile widened as she prepared to declare victory by default. Then Marcus's fingers touched the keys. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata Third Movement exploded into the ballroom with a precision and power that sent shockwaves through the crowd. This wasn't the tentative plinking of an amateur trying to recall a half-remembered tune. This was the work of a serious musician who knew every note, every nuance, every emotional peak and valley of one of classical music's most demanding pieces. Marcus's left hand attacked the bass notes with a strength that seemed impossible from his thin frame, while his right hand danced through the rapid 16th note passages with liquid grace. The music poured from the piano like water from a broken dam, filling every corner of the vast ballroom with sound that was both technically perfect and emotionally devastating. The guests who had been laughing and whispering fell silent, their mouths open in shock. The society women who had been recording the expected failure found themselves lowering their phones, too mesmerized to remember why they had taken them out. The men who had made cruel jokes about street musicians discovered they couldn't speak at all. Eleanor Whitfield's face underwent a remarkable transformation. Her confident smile faded first, replaced by confusion, as she realized that Marcus actually could play. The confusion shifted to dismay as she understood that he wasn't just playing competently, but brilliantly. And as the piece progressed, revealing depths of musicality that some professional pianists never achieved, her dismay curdled into something approaching panic. Professor Chen felt tears spring to his eyes as he recognized what he was witnessing. This wasn't just technically proficient playing. Marcus was interpreting Beethoven with an emotional maturity that defied his age and circumstances. The boy was telling a story through the music, and it was a story of loss, hope, struggle, and ultimate triumph that resonated with something deep in every listener's soul. The rapid arpeggios in the middle section cascaded from Marcus's fingers like silver rain. His hands moved with the fluid precision of a dancer, never hesitating, never fumbling, executing passages that would challenge conservatory graduates. But more than the technical mastery, it was the music itself that held the audience spellbound. Through Beethoven's notes, Marcus was speaking directly to their hearts in a language more honest than words. He was telling them about sleeping under bridges while dreaming of concert halls, about watching his little sister struggle to breathe while he felt helpless to save her, about carrying his grandfather's memory like a torch through the darkness of poverty and prejudice. A woman in the front row who had laughed at Marcus's appearance just minutes before found tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't understand why the music was affecting her so powerfully, only that she felt ashamed of her earlier cruelty and moved by the raw emotion pouring from the piano. As Marcus approached the final section, his playing reached an intensity that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with energy. His eyes were closed now, his head tilted back slightly, as if he were receiving the music from some divine source rather than creating it himself. The piano sang under his touch, producing tones so pure and powerful that even the hotel staff had stopped their work to listen. Eleanor tried desperately to maintain her composure, but inside she was reeling. Everything she believed about class breeding and natural superiority was crumbling around her as this homeless child played with a skill that made her daughter's expensive piano lessons look like kindergarten exercises. She caught sight of several guests staring at her with expressions that ranged from amazement to accusation, as if they were already blaming her for nearly denying them this transcendent experience. The final notes of the sonata rang out with crystalline clarity, hanging in the air like perfect jewels before slowly fading into silence. Marcus's hands remained poised above the keys for a moment, as if reluctant to break the connection with the music. Then he lowered them to his lap, opened his eyes, and looked out at an audience that had been completely transformed. For several heartbeats, no one moved, no one breathed. The silence was so profound that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He had given everything he had to that performance, pouring 3 years of pain and hope into Beethoven's masterpiece, and now he waited to learn if it had been enough. Then Professor Chen began to applaud, his hands coming together with slow, deliberate reverence. The sound seemed to break a spell, and suddenly the entire ballroom erupted in the kind of applause usually reserved for the world's greatest concert halls. People leaped to their feet, clapping and cheering with an enthusiasm that surprised even themselves. But in the front row, Eleanor Whitfield stood frozen like a statue, her face pale, and her eyes wide with something that might have been terror. She had promised to apologize and pay $500 if Marcus succeeded, never imagining that such a thing was possible. Now she faced the impossible choice between honoring her word and admitting that everything she believed about herself and her world was fundamentally wrong. Marcus sat quietly at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response, but trying to process what had just happened. He had played his heart out, but he wasn't sure if it had been enough to save his sister. All he knew was that for those few minutes, he had been exactly where his grandfather always said he belonged, at the piano making music that touched human souls. The applause continued for what felt like hours, washing over Marcus like a warm wave. And in his pocket, his grandfather's photograph seemed to whisper, "Well done, boy, well done." The applause gradually faded, but the stunned silence that followed was even more powerful than the cheering. Marcus remained seated at the piano bench, his small hand still trembling slightly from the intensity of his performance. The 300 guests stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, which in many ways they were. Professor Chen approached slowly, his face filled with awe and growing concern. He had recognized the name Samuel Thompson earlier, but hearing Marcus play had confirmed something extraordinary. This wasn't just inherited talent, this was the result of serious, dedicated training. Marcus Chen said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed ballroom, "Your grandfather Samuel, when did he teach you that piece?" Marcus looked up at the professor, still somewhat dazed from the performance. "He started teaching me Moonlight Sonata when I was 7. Took me 2 years to get it right. He said it was the hardest piece he'd ever learned, and if I could master it, I could play anything." "And when did your lessons with him end?" Chen asked gently, though he sensed the answer would be painful. Marcus's face clouded over, and he looked down at his hands. 2 years ago, when I was 10, Grandpa had a heart attack one night after we finished practicing. I found him the next morning, still sitting at his old piano." A ripple of sympathy ran through the crowd. Even Eleanor Whitfield felt her chest tighten at the image of a 10-year-old boy discovering his beloved teacher and grandfather dead at the piano they had shared. "I'm so sorry," Chen said quietly. "But Marcus, if your grandfather died 2 years ago, where have you been living? Who's been taking care of you?" This was the question Marcus had been dreading, but he knew there was no avoiding it now. The whole truth was going to come out, and these wealthy people would learn just how different his world was from theirs. "There wasn't anybody else to take care of us," Marcus said, his voice growing smaller but remaining steady. "My parents died when I was 9. Car accident. A drunk driver." The admission sent shocked murmurs through the ballroom. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, remembering their earlier cruel comments about proper families and good breeding. "Us," Chen asked, picking up on the word that others had missed. "My little sister Emma," Marcus explained. "She's 8 now. She was only 5 when Mom and Dad died, and 6 when Grandpa passed. The social workers wanted to put us in foster care, but they said we'd probably be separated. Different families. Emma's got asthma really bad, and she gets scared when I'm not there." Eleanor Whitfield felt her stomach drop as she began to understand the full scope of what this boy had been dealing with. But her pride wouldn't let her show the sympathy that was building inside her. "So what did you do?" Chen asked, though he was beginning to fear the answer. "We ran away from the group home," Marcus said simply. "I couldn't let them split us up. Emma needed me, so we've been living under the Jefferson Bridge for 3 years now." The silence that followed was deafening. 3 years. This 12-year-old boy had been responsible for keeping himself and his sick sister alive on the streets for 3 years, since he was 9 years old. 3 years. Chen repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, how have you been surviving?" "I do odd jobs when I can find them," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "Cleaning windows, carrying groceries, anything people will pay a kid to do. And I found an old electronic keyboard in a dumpster behind Miller's music store. Most of the keys don't work anymore, but I practice every night, so I don't forget what Grandpa taught me." A woman in diamonds near the front row covered her mouth with her hand, tears starting in her eyes as she imagined this talented child practicing on broken keys under a bridge. "The music helps Emma sleep better when she's having bad asthma attacks," Marcus continued. "Sometimes I play the melodies real quiet, and it calms her down when she can't breathe good. Professor Chen had to clear his throat before he could speak again. And tonight? Why did you come here tonight? Marcus's voice became urgent, desperate. Emma's been getting worse. Her inhaler ran out 3 days ago, and the free clinic won't give us another one without her having a real address. She was coughing all last night, and this morning she could barely talk. I heard about this charity event on the radio, and I thought, maybe if I could play well enough, someone might give me work. Real work. Enough to get her medicine and maybe some food. The weight of Marcus's words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Here was a child who had been dealt every possible disadvantage life could offer, yet he had maintained his musical skills and his devotion to his sister through 3 years of homelessness and hunger. I sold Grandpa's piano 2 years ago to buy Emma's first inhaler, Marcus added quietly. It was the only thing of his I had left, but she needed it more than I needed the memories. That admission broke something inside several of the guests. The idea that this boy had sacrificed his grandfather's piano, his last connection to the man who had given him music to save his sister's life, was almost too much to bear. Eleanor Whitfield stood frozen, her earlier confidence completely shattered. She had promised to pay Marcus $500 and apologize publicly if he succeeded. But now she understood that this wasn't just about one performance or one bet. This was about a child who was literally fighting for his sister's life with the only weapon he had, his grandfather's musical legacy. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph, the same one he had shown Chen earlier. But now he held it up for the whole crowd to see. "This is Grandpa at the Cotton Club in 1968, Marcus said, his voice filled with pride despite everything. "He always told me that music was bigger than whatever problems we had. He said if I could make people feel something real, then I belonged wherever there was a piano." The crowd stared at the photograph of Samuel Thompson, a man whose talent had been legendary, but whose grandson was now homeless and desperate. The irony was not lost on anyone. They were looking at musical royalty, a direct link to the golden age of American jazz, in the form of a hungry child begging for help to save his dying sister. Professor Chen took the photograph with reverence, studying it for a long moment before handing it back to Marcus. "Your grandfather was right," he said firmly. "You do belong wherever there's a piano, and after what we just heard, I think it's time we made sure you get the chances you deserve." But everyone in the room knew that the next move belonged to Eleanor Whitfield. She had made a public promise, and now the entire ballroom waited to see if she would honor her word or find some way to escape the consequences of being so completely publicly wrong. Marcus sat quietly, clutching his grandfather's photograph, thinking about his sister coughing under the bridge, waiting to learn if his miracle performance had been enough to save her life. Eleanor Whitfield stood in the center of the ballroom, like a statue, 300 pairs of eyes boring into her as she struggled with the most humiliating moment of her privileged life. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. Finally, Professor Chen cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the room. "I believe you made a promise." Eleanor's face flushed red as she realized there was no escape. Every guest in the ballroom had heard her bet, and many had recorded it on their phones. Her reputation, her social standing, everything depended on how she handled the next few minutes. "Yes," she said through gritted teeth, reaching into her designer purse with shaking hands. She pulled out a leather wallet and counted out 5 $100 bills, her movements stiff and mechanical. $500 as promised. She walked toward Marcus, her high heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. When she reached the piano, she held out the money with visible reluctance. "And the apology?" Chen prompted, his voice gentle but firm. Eleanor's jaw tightened. The words felt like broken glass in her throat. I apologize for doubting your abilities." Marcus took the money with trembling hands, hardly believing it was real. $500 was more money than he and Emma had seen in their entire 3 years on the streets. But before he could thank Eleanor, Professor Chen stepped forward. "Marcus, this is just the beginning." Chen announced, his voice rising with excitement. "What you've shown us tonight is extraordinary. I want to offer you a full scholarship to the Manhattan Music Conservatory. Room board, private lessons, everything you need to develop your talent properly." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. The Manhattan Music Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Students from wealthy families paid $50,000 a year just for tuition. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. You really mean it? I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Chen replied. But there are some practical matters we need to address. You'll need official documents, a permanent address, a legal guardian. The excitement on Marcus's face began to fade as the reality of his situation set in. I don't have any of those things, sir. No birth certificate, no school records. Emma and we don't exist in the system anymore. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. We can work around those obstacles. The first thing we need to do is get you both into temporary housing while we sort out the paperwork. There are programs for situations like this. But even as Chen spoke optimistically, Eleanor was already planning her revenge. The humiliation she had just endured was eating at her like acid, and she was not the type of woman to accept defeat gracefully. If this homeless boy thought he could embarrass her in front of her own social circle and walk away unscathed, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus discovered that Professor Chen's optimism was easier said than achieved. The first foster family they approached took one look at Marcus and Emma's circumstances and immediately declined. We're looking for children with more stability in their backgrounds, the well-dressed woman explained to the social worker, her eyes avoiding Marcus entirely. These kids have been living on the streets for years. Who knows what kind of trauma or behavioral issues they might have? The second family was more direct. The boy might be talented, but we can't take the risk, the man said bluntly. What if they steal from us? What if they bring other homeless people around? We have our own children to think about. Marcus felt each rejection like a physical blow, but he tried to stay positive for Emma's sake. His sister was getting the medical care she needed now, thanks to the money Eleanor had paid him, but her cough was still concerning the doctors. Meanwhile, Eleanor was working behind the scenes with ruthless efficiency. She used her connections and influence to contact music schools, philanthropic organizations, and social services departments. Her message was always the same, delivered with the smooth persuasion of someone accustomed to getting her way. I'm calling out of concern for the community, she would say, her voice dripping with false sincerity. This boy has been living unsupervised on the streets for years. There are questions about his background, his family's history with drugs and crime. Are we really prepared to invest significant resources in someone with such an uncertain past? She was careful never to say anything directly racist or legally actionable, but her implications were clear. She painted Marcus as a risk, a potential problem, a charity case that might look good in newspaper headlines, but would ultimately disappoint and embarrass the institutions that supported him. Professor Chen began to notice the unusual number of obstacles they were encountering. Phone calls went unreturned. Meetings were canceled at the last minute. Officials who had seemed enthusiastic initially began expressing concerns about due diligence and background checks. Something's not right, Chen confided to his wife over dinner. I've been placing talented students for 30 years, and I've never seen this level of resistance for someone with Marcus's abilities. The breakthrough came when Chen ran into an old colleague at a faculty meeting. Dr. Patricia Williams, who worked in educational administration, pulled him aside with a worried expression. David, I thought you should know, she said quietly. I've been getting calls about your protege, Marcus Thompson. Someone's been making inquiries about his background, asking pointed questions about whether it's wise to invest in high-risk students. Chen's blood ran cold. Who's been making these calls? I can't prove it, but the person who called me claimed to represent a concerned philanthropist, someone who was at the hotel performance and had reservations about the boy's suitability for prestigious programs. That evening, Chen drove to the temporary shelter where Marcus and Emma were staying. He found Marcus in the common room, practicing fingering exercises on his knees, since no piano was available. Emma sat nearby, coloring in a donated book, her breathing still slightly labored despite her new inhaler. Marcus, we need to talk, Chen said, sitting down beside the boy. Someone has been trying to sabotage your opportunities, someone with influence and connections. Marcus looked up with tired eyes. He had been trying so hard to stay hopeful, but each rejection was wearing down his spirit. Mrs. Whitfield. Chen nodded grimly. I can't prove it yet, but all the evidence points to her. She's been systematically undermining every opportunity we've tried to create for you. Marcus felt a familiar despair settling over him. So, what do we do? Do I give up on the conservatory? Absolutely not, Chen said firmly. But we're going to have to fight for this Marcus. and that means we need to be smarter and more determined than she is." Emma looked up from her coloring book. "Marcus, what's wrong?" Marcus forced a smile for his sister's sake. "Nothing, Em. Just grown-up stuff. How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, though her voice was still raspy. "The new medicine helps a lot." "Will we really get to live in a real house soon?" Marcus met Chen's eyes over his sister's head. The professor saw the determination there, the same fierce protectiveness that had kept these children alive for 3 years on the streets. "Yes, Em," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever it takes, we're going to get you a real house." But both Marcus and Chen knew that Eleanor Whitfield had resources and connections that went far beyond what they could match. The fight for Marcus's future was just beginning, and their opponent was someone who would stop at nothing to avoid being proven wrong by a homeless black child. Outside the shelter, Eleanor's private investigator sat in an unmarked car, taking photographs and making notes. Eleanor had hired him to find anything in Marcus's background that could be used to discredit the boy permanently. She was prepared to spend whatever it took to make sure that her humiliation at the Royal Grand Hotel would never be repeated. The battle lines were drawn, and Marcus's musical dreams hung in the balance. 3 months after the incident at the Royal Grand Hotel, Professor Chen received a phone call that would change everything. The caller was Margaret Harrison, director of the Young Virtuoso competition, one of the most prestigious youth music contests in the country. "Professor Chen, I've been hearing remarkable things about a student of yours," Margaret said, her voice warm with interest. "The video of his performance at the charity gala has been circulating among music educators, and frankly, we're all astounded." Chen felt his heart rate quicken. "You're talking about Marcus Thompson?" "Indeed. I'd like to invite him to compete in this year's Young Virtuoso competition. The winner receives a 4-year full scholarship to any conservatory of their choice, plus a $50,000 cash prize." Chen nearly dropped the phone. The Young Virtuoso competition was legendary in classical music circles. Past winners had gone on to become world-renowned concert pianists. But there was one problem he knew he had to address immediately. "Margaret, I need to be honest with you about Marcus's situation. He's homeless. He's been living in temporary shelters, and there are some people with significant influence who have been working against him." "I'm aware of his circumstances," Margaret replied. "In fact, that's part of why we want him to compete. The board believes that true talent should be recognized regardless of social background. This competition could be exactly what he needs to overcome the obstacles he's facing." When Chen told Marcus about the invitation, the boy's reaction was a mixture of excitement and terror. They were sitting in the shelter's common room where Marcus had been practicing on an old donated keyboard with several broken keys. "A real competition?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Against other kids who've been taking lessons their whole lives. 20 of the most talented young pianists in the country," Chen confirmed, ages 12 to 16. "But Marcus, you have something they don't have. You have a story to tell through your music, and that emotional depth can't be taught in any conservatory." Emma, who had been listening from her cot nearby, sat up with excitement. "Marcus, that's amazing. You're going to win." Marcus wasn't so sure. "Professor, these other kids, they've probably had everything handed to them. Private lessons, perfect pianos, sheet music concert halls to practice in. What if I'm not good enough?" "You are good enough," Chen said firmly. "But I won't lie to you. This will be the biggest challenge you've ever faced." What Chen didn't tell Marcus was that Eleanor Whitfield had learned about the competition invitation within hours of it being extended. Her network of social connections included several board members of cultural organizations, and word traveled fast in elite circles. Eleanor immediately reached out to Margaret Harrison, using her most persuasive voice and her family's history of charitable contributions to the arts. "Margaret, I feel I must share some concerns about this Marcus Thompson boy," Eleanor said during what she framed as a friendly call between philanthropists. "While his performance was certainly interesting, I worry about the message we send by elevating someone with such an unstable background. The competition has always maintained certain standards." But Margaret Harrison was not easily influenced. "Mrs. Whitfield, with respect, I've watched the video of his performance multiple times. What that boy accomplished was nothing short of miraculous. The competition exists to discover exceptional talent, not to preserve social hierarchies." Frustrated by her failure to dissuade the competition organizers, Eleanor decided on a different strategy. If she couldn't prevent Marcus from competing, she would ensure he failed as publicly and humiliatingly as possible. Eleanor used her connections to manipulate the competition schedule. Through a board member who owed her family significant favors, she arranged for Marcus to perform last, after 20 other competitors had already played and the audience would be tired and restless. She also influenced the selection process to ensure that Marcus would be competing against the most privileged and well-trained young musicians money could produce. The competition was held at Lincoln Center in the same concert hall where legends like Leonard Bernstein had conducted the New York Philharmonic. As Marcus walked into the building with Professor Chen, he felt overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding him. The other competitors were easy to spot. They arrived with their families in expensive cars carrying custom-made instrument cases dressed in designer concert attire. Marcus wore a black suit that Chen had bought for him at a discount store, which was still slightly too big, despite alterations. "Look at that," one mother whispered to another as Marcus passed by. "Is that the homeless boy everyone's been talking about? How did he even qualify for this competition? I heard someone's been pulling strings for him." Another parent replied, "It's really not fair to the children who've worked so hard and sacrificed so much for their musical education." Marcus tried to ignore the stares and whispers, but Emma noticed his discomfort. She had been allowed to attend thanks to Chen's intervention, and she squeezed her brother's hand reassuringly. "Remember what Grandpa used to say," she whispered. "The piano doesn't care what you're wearing or where you live. It only cares what's in your heart." The competition format was brutal. Each contestant had to perform one required piece chosen by the judges, plus one piece of their own selection. The required piece this year was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 Third Movement, a technically demanding work that pushed even advanced pianists to their limits. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus watched competitor after competitor take the stage. They were all exceptionally talented, playing with the polished precision that came from years of expensive instruction. The audience applauded politely after each performance, but Marcus could sense their attention waning as the event dragged on. By the time Marcus's name was called, it was nearly evening. Many audience members had left, and those who remained seemed tired and restless. Eleanor Whitfield sat in the front row, her satisfied smile indicating that everything was going according to her plan. Marcus walked onto the stage at Lincoln Center, the same stage where musical giants had performed for decades. The concert grand piano seemed to glow under the stage lights, waiting for him like an old friend. But as he sat at the bench and looked out at the audience, he felt the weight of their skepticism and exhaustion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said with noticeably less enthusiasm than he had shown for earlier competitors, "our final performer is Marcus Thompson, age 12. The applause was polite but sparse. Marcus could see Eleanor in the front row, her arms crossed, waiting for his inevitable failure. But then he spotted Professor Chen and Emma sitting several rows back, both giving him encouraging nods. Marcus had chosen to perform his own selection first, Rhapsody in Blue, by George Gershwin, a piece that bridged the gap between classical and jazz, just like his grandfather had taught him. It was a risky choice, as most competitors had played traditional classical pieces, but Marcus felt it represented who he truly was as a musician. As he placed his hands on the keys, Marcus felt the familiar transformation begin. The tired audience, the skeptical judges, Eleanor's hostile stare, all of it faded away. He was no longer a homeless boy trying to prove himself to people who didn't want to believe in him. He was Samuel Thompson's grandson, carrying forward a musical legacy that had been passed down through generations. The opening notes of Rhapsody in Blue filled Lincoln Center with a sound that was both technically precise and emotionally raw. Marcus played with a freedom and spontaneity that none of the other competitors had displayed, incorporating subtle jazz elements that his grandfather had taught him, making Gershwin's masterpiece his own. The audience began to sit up straighter, their fatigue forgotten, as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just another polished performance by a well-trained student. This was an artist telling his story through music, sharing his pain and hope and dreams through every note. When Marcus transitioned into the Rachmaninoff Concerto, the contrast was stunning. Where Rhapsody in Blue had been personal and intimate, the Rachmaninoff was powerful and dramatic, showcasing technical skills that left the judges speechless. But more than the technique, it was the emotional intensity that captivated everyone present. Through Rachmaninoff's complex passages, Marcus was telling the story of his 3 years on the streets, his fight to save his sister, his grandfather's lessons echoing through the concert hall. The music became a bridge between his past and his future, between the world he came from and the world he was trying to enter. Eleanor Whitfield's confident smile had completely disappeared. She sat frozen in her front row seat, watching as her carefully orchestrated plan to humiliate Marcus backfired spectacularly. The audience was completely captivated, hanging on every note, and she could see the judges leaning forward with obvious amazement. When Marcus finished, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. Then the applause began, not the polite clapping that had followed the other performances, but the kind of thunderous ovation usually reserved for world-class concert pianists. The entire audience rose to their feet, cheering and shouting with an enthusiasm that shook the walls of Lincoln Center. Marcus sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response, but also emotionally drained from pouring his entire soul into the performance. He had given everything he had, and now all he could do was wait to learn if it had been enough. The judges didn't need long to deliberate. While Marcus didn't win first place, which went to a technically flawless 16-year-old from a prestigious music academy, he was awarded something even more meaningful, the Audience Choice Award, in a special recognition for Most Outstanding Artistic Interpretation. More importantly, the performance had been recorded and would soon be broadcast on classical music channels across the country. Marcus Thompson, the homeless boy from the Jefferson Bridge, was about to become a household name in the music world. But as he stood on stage accepting his award, Marcus's eyes found Eleanor Whitfield in the audience. Her face was a mask of barely controlled rage, and he knew instinctively that this victory would come with a price. The real battle was just beginning. The video of Marcus's performance at the Young Virtuoso competition went viral within 48 hours. News outlets picked up the story of the homeless boy who had stunned Lincoln Center, and social media exploded with shares, comments, and praise. The hashtag #MarcusThompsonPiano began trending nationwide, with classical music lovers and social justice advocates alike celebrating his triumph. But Eleanor Whitfield's nightmare was just beginning. 3 days after the competition, investigative reporter Sarah Martinez received an anonymous tip that would change everything. Someone had leaked a series of emails and recorded phone conversations that revealed Eleanor's systematic campaign to sabotage Marcus's opportunities. Sarah, who worked for the city's most respected newspaper, had been following Marcus's story since the Royal Grand Hotel incident. When she opened the encrypted file that had been sent to her secure email, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Email after email showed Eleanor contacting music schools, foster agencies, and philanthropic organizations with carefully worded warnings about Marcus. Phone recordings captured her voice, making subtle but unmistakable implications about his character and background. In one particularly incriminating email to a conservatory director, Eleanor had written, "While I admire the impulse to help disadvantaged youth, we must consider whether investing significant resources in children from such unstable backgrounds serves our long-term institutional goals. The boy's talent may be real, but talent without proper breeding and moral foundation often leads to disappointment." Another recording caught Eleanor speaking to a board member of a youth music program. "I'm not saying the child is dangerous, of course, but 3 years on the streets, no family supervision possible, exposure to criminal elements. Can we really risk our reputation on such an unknown quantity?" Sarah Martinez worked through the night, cross-referencing the timeline of Eleanor's interference with the obstacles Marcus had faced. The pattern was undeniable. Every door that had been slammed in Marcus's face, every opportunity that had mysteriously evaporated, could be traced back to Eleanor's influence. The story ran on the front page of the Sunday edition with the headline, "Society Matron Waged Secret War Against Homeless Piano Prodigy." The article laid out Eleanor's campaign in devastating detail, complete with quotes from the leaked emails and transcripts of the recorded conversations. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by national news networks. Eleanor's face was plastered across television screens and newspaper front pages, identified as the wealthy socialite who had tried to destroy a child's dreams out of spite and prejudice. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Eleanor's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments calling her everything from heartless to racist. Her phone rang constantly with reporters demanding interviews and statements. Protesters gathered outside the Whitfield family's textile company headquarters, carrying signs that read, "Shame on Eleanor," and "Music has no color." The business consequences came just as quickly. Within a week, 3 major retail chains announced they were canceling contracts with Whitfield Textiles, citing concerns about the company's values alignment. The stock price plummeted as investors fled, and several board members demanded Eleanor's immediate resignation from all company positions. Eleanor's position as chairwoman of the Children's Music Foundation was terminated within days. The board's statement was brief, but devastating. "We cannot continue to associate with someone whose actions stand in direct opposition to our mission of supporting young musical talent regardless of background." Her membership in exclusive social clubs was quietly revoked. Invitations to charity galas and society events stopped arriving. Friends who had once competed for her attention now crossed the street to avoid her. Eleanor Whitfield, who had spent her entire life at the center of high society, suddenly found herself completely isolated. The final blow came when the Whitfield family board of directors, led by Eleanor's own cousin, voted to remove her from all executive positions in the company her great-grandfather had founded. The official statement cited conduct detrimental to the company's reputation and values. Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing the opposite transformation. Offers poured in from music schools, recording companies, and concert promoters. A famous pianist offered to become his mentor. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his story. A major publishing house approached him about writing a memoir. Professor Chen helped Marcus navigate the sudden attention, but they both knew that the most important development was yet to come. Several wealthy families had stepped forward, offering to provide Marcus and Emma with stable homes where Marcus could continue his musical education. The Wilson family, who owned a chain of music stores and had 3 adopted children of their own, invited Marcus and Emma to live with them permanently. Their home included a music room with a concert-quality grand piano, and they promised that Marcus would have unlimited access to practice time and professional instruction. "We're not doing this for publicity," Mrs. Wilson explained during their first meeting. "We're doing it because every child deserves a chance to develop their gifts, and you two deserve a real family." Emma, who had been quiet and withdrawn during much of their ordeal, began to smile again for the first time in months. The idea of having a real bedroom, regular meals, and most importantly, the security of knowing they would never be separated seemed too good to be true. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Musicians from around the world began reaching out to Marcus, sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity and offering support and encouragement. A famous violinist who had grown up in poverty sent a handwritten letter. A pianist who had fled his war-torn homeland as a child called to offer advice. "You represent something bigger than just your individual talent," a renowned conductor told Marcus during a video call. "You've shown the world that greatness can come from anywhere, and that prejudice is always wrong. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small again." The transformation of public opinion was complete when Marcus appeared on a major television talk show. The host, who had clearly done her research, asked him directly about Eleanor's campaign against him. "How do you feel about Mrs. Whitfield now? Marcus, are you angry with her for trying to sabotage your opportunities?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm sad for her," he said quietly. "I think she was so worried about protecting what she thought was hers that she forgot how to see people as just people. My grandfather always told me that hate hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else." The grace and maturity of his response impressed viewers across the country and further cemented Marcus as a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice. Eleanor, watching the interview from her increasingly empty mansion, felt something crack inside her chest. This child, whom she had tried so hard to destroy, was showing more class and wisdom than she had displayed in her entire privileged life. 3 months after the young virtuoso competition, Eleanor Whitfield sat alone in her study, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that detailed the complete collapse of her former life. She had lost her position in the family business, her social standing, most of her wealth, and all of her friends. But the worst part wasn't the money or the status. The worst part was the knowledge that she had tried to crush the dreams of a talented, innocent child out of nothing more than wounded pride and deep-seated prejudice. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Whitfield was forced to confront the ugly truth about who she really was. And she didn't like what she saw. Outside her window, she could see a group of neighborhood children playing in the park across the street. Among them was a young black boy about Marcus's age, laughing and running with his friends. Eleanor watched him for a long time, wondering what kind of dreams lived in his heart, and whether there were other people like her in the world who had tried to destroy those dreams simply because they threatened the comfortable lies they told themselves about superiority and worth. The reckoning she had avoided her entire life had finally arrived, and Eleanor Whitfield was utterly, completely alone with the consequences of her choices. 18 months after her fall from grace, Eleanor Whitfield stood in the cramped office of the South Side Community Center filing donation forms and organizing meal schedules for the homeless shelter program. Her manicured nails were gone, replaced by hands that showed the honest wear of real work. Her designer clothes had been sold long ago, and she now wore simple jeans and a volunteer t-shirt. The transformation had not been easy. After losing everything, Eleanor had spent months in bitter isolation, drinking expensive wine alone in her increasingly empty mansion, until even that had to be sold to pay legal fees and settlements. Rock bottom came when she found herself standing outside the Jefferson Bridge one evening, staring at the makeshift shelters where Marcus and Emma had once lived. That night, she had finally understood the true scope of what she had tried to destroy. Standing in the cold, looking at the cardboard and tarp structures that had been home to 2 children for 3 years, Eleanor felt shame so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. The next morning, she had walked into the Southside Community Center and asked if they needed volunteers. The director, Maria Santos, had recognized her immediately, but had also seen something in Eleanor's eyes that made her decide to give the disgraced socialite a chance. "I can't pay you," Maria had said bluntly, "and the work is hard. You'll be serving meals to homeless people, helping with job applications, cleaning bathrooms. Are you sure this is what you want?" "I need to understand," Eleanor had replied quietly. "I need to learn how to be a better person than I was." The work had been humbling in ways Eleanor never could have imagined. She served meals to people she once would have crossed the street to avoid. She helped fill out government assistance forms for families struggling with poverty and addiction. She cleaned up after people who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. Slowly, painfully, Eleanor began to see the humanity she had spent her entire life ignoring. She met mothers working 3 jobs who still couldn't afford rent. She encountered veterans with untreated mental illness living on the streets. She learned the names and stories of people who had been invisible to her when she lived in her bubble of privilege. But most importantly, she began to understand the magnitude of her sin against Marcus Thompson. She had tried to deny a gifted child his future, not because of anything he had done, but because his success threatened her worldview and wounded her pride. Meanwhile, Marcus's life had been transformed beyond recognition. Living with the Wilson family, he thrived both personally and musically. Emma's health improved dramatically with proper medical care and nutrition, and she had started school for the first time in years. Marcus was now studying at the Manhattan Music Conservatory while living at home the best of both worlds that Chen had envisioned for him. His talent continued to astound everyone who heard him play. He had performed with several youth orchestras, recorded an album of his grandfather's jazz compositions, and was already being courted by major concert halls for future performances. But perhaps most remarkably, Marcus had maintained the grace and humility that had impressed the television audience during his interview. The idea for the concert came to Marcus during a conversation with Professor Chen about giving back to the community. Marcus wanted to perform a benefit concert for homeless services, but he insisted on one specific venue, the Royal Grand Hotel, where his journey had begun. "Are you sure about this location?" Chen asked. "There might be painful memories associated with that place." Marcus shook his mind. "That's exactly why it needs to be there. I want to show people that stories can have different endings than the ones we expect." When the concert was announced, tickets sold out within hours. The media coverage was extensive, with reporters calling it a triumphant return to the scene of Marcus's first public performance. All proceeds would benefit the Southside Community Center and other homeless services organizations. Eleanor learned about the concert from Maria Santos, who mentioned it casually while they were sorting donated clothes. "That boy the one who plays piano so beautifully, he's giving a concert to raise money for places like this," Maria said, watching Eleanor's reaction carefully. Eleanor's hand stilled on the clothes she was folding. She had been following Marcus's success from a distance, reading newspaper articles about his performances and achievements. Each story was like a knife to her heart, reminding her of what she had almost destroyed. "He's a remarkable young man," Eleanor said quietly. "He is," Maria agreed. "You know he's never said a single bitter word about what happened to him. Not once. He talks about learning from difficult experiences and moving forward. It's quite extraordinary for someone so young." That evening, Eleanor sat in her small apartment and did something she had been working up the courage to do for months. She wrote a letter to Marcus Thompson. The letter took her 3 hours to write and went through 7 drafts. How do you apologize for trying to destroy someone's life? How do you ask forgiveness for actions rooted in prejudice and hatred? In the end, Eleanor kept it simple and honest. "Dear Marcus, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to read this letter. I wanted you to know that I have spent the last 18 months trying to understand the person I was when we first met and trying to become someone better. I cannot undo the harm I tried to cause you, but I can acknowledge it fully and tell you how deeply, truly sorry I am. Your talent, your character, and your grace have taught me more about human dignity than I learned in 45 years of privilege. I am working at the Southside Community Center now, trying to help people I once ignored. It's small penance for my actions, but it's helping me understand what I should have known all along, that worth comes from what's in a person's heart, not from the circumstances of their birth. I wish you and Emma all the happiness in the world. You deserve nothing but joy. Sincerely, Eleanor Whitfield." She mailed the letter without expecting a response. Marcus owed her nothing, least of all forgiveness. 3 days before the concert, Eleanor was surprised to receive a phone call at the community center. The voice on the other end was older than she remembered, but unmistakably Marcus. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Marcus Thompson. I got your letter." Eleanor's heart stopped. "Marcus, I don't know what to say." "I wanted to invite you to my concert," Marcus said simply. "I know it might be uncomfortable for you, but I'd like you to be there." Eleanor couldn't speak for several seconds. "You want me there after everything I did?" "My grandfather used to tell me that music is about bringing people together, not keeping them apart. This concert is about second chances, and I think maybe we both deserve one." The night of the concert, Eleanor arrived at the Royal Grand Hotel wearing the same simple dress she had worn to work at the community center. She felt like an imposter among the elegantly dressed crowd, many of whom recognized her and whispered among themselves. But Marcus had left a ticket for her in the front row next to Professor Chen and the Wilson family. Emma, now 10 years old and healthy, smiled at Eleanor with the open warmth that only children possess. "You're the lady who gave Marcus his first big chance," Emma said innocently. "He told me the whole story. https://u2.b/f0 2joie-c3 OSI CT's Bidel 6 UZNT at a lavish party in a luxury hotel. The city's elites are laughing and mingling. Suddenly, a 12-year-old homeless boy walks in and asks to play the piano for food for his sick little sister. His presence draws shocked stares, and Eleanor, the host, insults him and mocks his poverty. She challenges him to play one of the most difficult pieces even top music students struggle with. But when the boy strikes the first notes, Eleanor is forced to face her own humiliation. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Eleanor felt tears start in her eyes. Leave it to Marcus to frame their encounter in terms of opportunity rather than obstacle. When Marcus took the stage, the applause was thunderous. He looked confident and poised every inch the professional musician he had become. But when his eyes found Eleanor in the front row, he smiled and nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and invitation. "Tonight's concert is dedicated to everyone who believes in second chances," Marcus announced to the audience. "We all make mistakes, and we all have the capacity to learn and grow from them. Music has the power to heal wounds and build bridges between people who thought they could never understand each other." He began with Moonlight Sonata, the piece that had started everything. But this time his interpretation was different, richer, full of compassion and understanding rather than desperate hope. When he finished, he looked directly at Eleanor and said, "That was for everyone who helped me get here, including those who challenged me to prove myself." The concert continued with a mix of classical pieces and his grandfather's jazz compositions, each performance more beautiful than the last. But the most powerful moment came at the end when Marcus played an original composition he had written called Second Chances. The piece was a musical journey that began in darkness and struggle evolved through conflict and pain and ultimately resolved in harmony and hope. It was the story of his life, but it was also the story of anyone who had ever fallen and found the strength to rise again. When the concert ended, the standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. But Marcus's eyes kept finding Eleanor in the crowd, and she knew he was offering her something precious, the possibility of redemption through forgiveness. After the audience dispersed, Eleanor approached the stage where Marcus was packing up his sheet music. They stood facing each other for a moment, two people whose lives had been forever changed by their encounter. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply, "for the letter for tonight, for showing me what grace looks like." Marcus stepped forward and extended his hand. "Thank you for teaching me that people can change, and for helping me understand that forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger, it's about making room for something better." They shook hands, and in that moment, the circle was complete. The homeless boy and the privileged socialite had both been transformed by their journey, and both had learned that true nobility comes not from what you're born with, but from what you choose to do with whatever life gives you. As Eleanor walked out of the Royal Grand Hotel that night, she passed the piano where Marcus had first played for her 18 months ago. She paused and placed her hand gently on its surface, remembering the moment when a 12-year-old boy had tried to teach her something about the power of dreams. She had been too proud to listen then, but she was listening now, and the music of redemption was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Outside, the city sparkled with possibility, and somewhere in the distance, the melody of Second Chances still echoed in the night air, reminding everyone who heard it that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.